As we approach the holiday driving season, or really any other time you are traveling great distances on the road, you will find yourself at least tempted to exit the expressway to get a quick bite to eat when you see the familiar sight of the McDonald's logo peeking up over the guardrails. Maybe that just happened as I said it. This is the EPS podcast, and yes, today's episode is about McDonald's, but not from the approach that you might be thinking. McDonald's has two origin stories in the United States. The first came in the 1940s as a product of the economic boom immediately following the Second World War and the harnessing of efficiency and quality by Dick and Mack McDonald, involving their San Bernardino, California burger stand. The second is the franchise McDonald's, spearheaded a few years later by Ray Kroc and built alongside the expanding network of interstate expressways. Both iterations are documents of the same general time period and inform us greatly of American society, economics, government, and the culture of the era. But what about when the Golden Arches found their way outside of the United States to completely different continents? What is that a product of? What can McDonald's becoming part of other nations' popular culture tell us about the time period that it happened? To answer these questions and more, I turn to Johan of Edutainment Daily, who is a historian in Sweden. As you'll learn, McDonald's in Sweden and Europe at large is reflective of much different circumstances than in the United States. Welcome back to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source. I'm Eric Paul, and I am joined today by a guest who I was just saying a moment ago is the furthest away I've ever done a podcast. And it's only appropriate. I know you can't see the video right now, but I just happened to put on a Back to the Future shirt on. Didn't mean to do that today. I just kind of threw it on. And then I'm like, wait a minute, I'm going to be talking to the future. So he is in Sweden and I am here in the States. And this is Johan, and he is the host of Edutainment Daily. And before we get into our topic for today, which is McDonald's, and I'll give the listeners a little bit more of what we're going to do with that. I've been watching your videos for going on about a year now. And what prompted you to make your Edutainment Daily films?
Oh, it's a great question. I mean, I work as a teacher for what you would probably consider upper high school. So it's kids between 16 and 19. And my primary subject that I teach is history. So, and I also have this problem with keeping my mind straight when I research stuff. So researching a lesson on the French Revolution, I tend to go on 1 million side paths.
Yeah.
And all those side paths I want to put on I want to do something with them.
Right. So
I started up Edutainment Daily on Instagram to write some posts about things I thought were interesting, make some videos, and it's gone quite nice since. It's just a great creative way for me to express what I know. Right.
And I think that's why I initially thought to myself, like, we'd make a great match because, you know, the essence of my program, and I'm a teacher as well, is everything is a primary source. And so therefore, I don't limit myself as far as what I'm interested in. And what you're definitely recognizing and reporting out is everything has a history, you know, like, and I am the same way when I do my research. Next, if I'm doing it on the computer, there's so many tabs open after a while because you're just going down one pathway to another. And, next thing you know, you're like, man, there's way too much here to deliver in a class. Exactly. And so it's great that you have an outlet like Instagram and I love your videos. I think they're just fantastic. And I'm glad that we could make this work out. So our topic today, and we're going to do something different here on the EPS podcast than usual, where usually we just take one movie or TV show or food or, any kind of pop culture thing and break it down. But today we're going to do a little compare and contrast because a few weeks ago, we were tossing back and forth, like, what would you do for a topic? And you posted something about McDonald's and, fast food in general. And I said to myself, I'm like, I am very acutely aware of the history of McDonald's and fast food in this country, in the United States, because back in graduate school, I did a a whole paper about it, a thesis paper, correlating the interstate highways and the rise of fast food in this country. And so I thought to myself, but that can't be true globally. And so we talked, and you said that you would start looking into when McDonald's arrived specifically in Sweden. And I thought we could do a compare and contrast about, when it came to the United States, when it, kind of came up, compared to 20 years later when it started to show up in Europe. And so that's how we're going to go about it today. And I'll put my share screen up with the analysis form, so we have some conversation points. So when it comes to McDonald's, the material it's made from, we don't have to get into all of the nitty gritty of it, but essentially it's hamburgers, French fries, milkshakes, the standard, what we consider as fast food. I was telling you before that when I was in Europe, I was in Amsterdam a few months ago, and I was looking around, like, there's just so many hamburger places here. And then it hit me, I'm like, oh yeah, because Hamburg is from here. So hamburgers existed right in Europe before McDonald's showed up in the 70s.
Yes, that is very true. But especially in Sweden, it's actually arrived way later than in United States, because Sweden is some sort of weird Nordic country that doesn't really get influences from Europe in things like that all the time. So there have been hamburgers in Sweden in the way that you put meat between two breads, yes. But the hamburger actually arrived in 1955. Okay. And we can actually put a very specific year when this, a very specific time where this happened. And it was one of these, these world expos. There were one in Paris, there were one in Stockholm, just to showcase all this new stuff. We had a small expo, a European expo in a town called Helsingborg in southern Sweden, where the first hamburger arrived and were tried in the country. And so I think this is one of few times where you can actually put a start point to something as basic as a hamburger.
It is interesting because it's like that's right, almost the exact time period that McDonald's was branching out from its original stand in Southern California. And I mentioned moments ago, I correlate that with, because that's also simultaneous in this country when the interstate highways were coming into being. And that also has to do with the material of it, or the how is it made component, because without the car culture, the mass appeal of travel, the ability to go from one end of the country to the other, and wanting to, as an avid traveler myself, when I go on trips, as much as at my final destination, I like to have something unique and different, specific to the place I am. Along the path, I'm perfectly fine with just jumping off the highway and getting something familiar like McDonald's or Wendy's or Burger King, and then getting back on the road and moving along. And so that's where McDonald's really kind of found its place in American culture in the 50s. And the interstate highway system is very much inspired by European roadways. That during and after the Second World War, General Eisenhower really admired the way that the German Autobahn system was networked throughout Germany, so that it allowed for basically a defense highway, so that troops and vehicles could make their way from one border to the other. And then in civilian use, high-speed roads to allow people to travel very high speeds, and all the good benefits the economy gets from that. And so that when he became president, he signed into legislation the Interstate Highway Act, which allowed for states to get the funding to build these super highways, and then McDonald's shows up. And so it's funny how it's kind of like back and forth across the Atlantic.
Yeah.
is going with that we're taking the idea of these big time roads, applying it to the American geography, which then seeps into the culture. When did McDonald's first arrive in Europe and Sweden specifically?
In Europe, we're talking like late 1950s, somewhere there. And in Sweden, 1973.
Okay.
And more specifically, it arrives in 1973 in Stockholm after a very long and hard time to establish the hamburger as a concept. Because one thing that I found out researching this, that I did not think that I would go down this rabbit hole, but I did, is that the hamburger was actually pretty much illegal in Sweden when it came.
Really?
Yes. And this is because Sweden has a very strict, following the book culture.
Mm.
And in Sweden, all of the fast food, we didn't have any big brands. We had more local street grills where you would enter this small hut with a couple of seats, and they would be grilling mainly hot dogs at the time. Hot dog was the big thing. And, sell it. And these were established in like a couple in every city, but by like private persons, not by a big company.
Right.
And in these, there were very strict regulations of what you could sell. There could be like street grills for hot food and street grills for cold food. And in the hot foods, you could sell things like hot dogs, you could sell herring, you could sell meatballs, but you could not sell a hamburger because that is not on the list.
Oh.
And in the cold street grill, you could sell ice cream, you could sell sandwiches, but you could not sell a hamburger because that's not on the list, because that's a mix between hot and cold things. And then you might wonder, what about the hot dog? Well, the hot dog was specifically put on the list for some reason, so that could be sold.
That's so funny.
Yes.
You go. Well, how far back do those regulations go?
Well, Sweden started, fast food arrived in Sweden with another expo, actually. The Stockholm expo of, let's see, I put it in my notes here. It was 1897. Then the hot dog became established as a fast food in Sweden. And from there, all these street grills start to pop up with the regulations coming from the state. So it was a long, hard fight for the hamburger to get established, and it had to be fought at a politics level. There were several examples, one from Stockholm in 1957, when one politician chose to look between his fingers. He didn't choose to acknowledge that a hamburger was sold, and it was put to court.
Oh, geez.
So this politician claimed that, well, how could we distinguish a hamburger from just a meatball between two buns?
Yeah.
And he won that case. So from there, it started to be more and more established around the country before McDonald's came then in 1973.
That's so wild, because in the United States, there's a bit of, it's like a lot of other things, like who started it first, like where'd the hamburger come from, as we know it, with the toppings and everything. And, some people say it was as simple as somebody taking a meatball and smashing it down to size. But I'm like, but meatball tastes a lot different from a hamburger or cheeseburger. I mean, especially, depending on, the spices and stuff you put in a meatball. So that doesn't seem quite right. And then, there's places that, but really the long and short of it is that it seems that the hamburger with putting meat between two bread is symbolic of both it's like working class food. It's quick, easy to make. It's for people who are either on break from their job and go to a diner, go to a grill and grab something quick to eat, and then get back to work, or for on the way home. Something along those methods. So like diners in this country precede fast food, but it was also pretty quick. They had dining cars that they would set up, and they would be separate from, they would be the size of a streetcar or a rail car, and sit maybe 15 people, and you'd have a grill. And it sounds a lot what you're describing in city streets in Sweden as well. And people would just come in, they'd open, incredibly early for the morning shift guys, to come in, get their breakfast first thing, and then be on their way to work. And then they'd stay open through lunch and everything, basically supporting, the labor force of the country. But by the 50s, it's, post World War II, there's a lot of big changes that have taken place globally. I mean, there's a world war. And, either directly or indirectly, everything seems to be coming from that and developing from that. So the next question that comes up is who likely made it? And for the United States version of McDonald's, that's actually kind of a controversial subject. On the one hand, you have Dick and Mack McDonald, who were from where I live in New Hampshire, but made their business in Southern California years later after moving out there and, trying to find the right working. I need to ask you, Johan, have you seen the movie The Founder with Michael Keaton?
I have not.
It's a fairly recent movie, just a couple years old, and it's all about the history of McDonald's and how, because if you go into a lot of McDonald's here, maybe in Sweden as well, they oftentimes have a plaque to a third man by the name of Ray Kroc. And Ray Kroc was a businessman from Illinois who was selling milkshake mixers. And because of McDonald's selling milkshakes, he ended up crossing paths with them, was dazzled by their speedy system, their ability to make hamburgers and cheeseburgers and fries and milkshakes in 30 seconds for their customers, their walk-up customers. And he said, this needs to be national. And so he made it his mission to spread McDonald's all over the United States, everywhere in the country. And so as such, he started to refer to himself as the founder of McDonald's. And that the Des Plaines store in Illinois, he claimed was McDonald's #1, even though the San Bernardino, California one. So kind of a, controversial thing, because he eventually bought out the company name and the rights to the name from the McDonald's brothers. And, less than on the level as far as, the way he did all of that stuff. But his status in society, leading up to that point, at least the way the movie portrays it, was that he was kind of a struggling businessman, that he was having tough time adjusting to the new ways of the American economy. He was still stuck maybe pre-war mentalities, going door to door salesmanship, whereas the McDonald's brothers had perfected this highly efficient, super fast, yet family-friendly operation. And that he more or less just kind of stole that and brought it to the rest of the country. When McDonald's came to Europe and when it came to Sweden, was there a particular person behind it, or was it sort of like a corporate move?
No, this is very interesting as well, because it's the exact same thing. Because when it came to Europe, it all depended on individual entrepreneurs that went to America and saw this, this chain of McDonald's restaurants, and thought that I could bring this back to Europe. And this is how it's run. It's still running to this day. Each McDonald's restaurant is run by, somewhat independently and they just pay this franchise price. So, but in Sweden, it's a man with a name so good that you can't make it up. It's Paul Lederhausen, who brought McDonald's. He was this entrepreneur, and he were actually selling industrial kitchen machines, and went over to the United States. He saw McDonald's, he loved it, and he brought it back. And as you might, looking back at this street grill, this was not a street grill. This was a restaurant in its own, so it could be used, and it could be it could produce hamburgers in Sweden. It was extremely popular very quickly, and this was the case probably all over Europe. Mm-hmm.
Because was Europe by the 60s and 70s also moving faster? Was it seem like that was the tenor of the day, was that people were looking to not necessarily sit in a place for very long, just kind of get their food and go. And because to me, fast food like I said, earlier, for myself, I try to keep away from as much as possible because I know it's not good for you. But there is something pretty satisfying of looking at your clock and be like, oh, I only have, 20 minutes. Okay, I can go to McDonald's really fast, get my food, and I can, I can feed my whole family if I really needed to for, pretty cheap amount of money. And I know I'm not the only one that has that same exact attitude. That's pretty much been I've grown up with McDonald's and all the fast food places, right there with me. And so has everybody else who's been alive since the 50s. Was that the way that Europe was developing as well, particularly in Scandinavia too? Fast paced, everybody moving quickly and, not wanting to waste time. And that's why McDonald's really, spoke to them.
To some extent, yes. I mean, Sweden, Europe as a whole entered this boom of urbanization, a boom of like capitalism, growth, wealth during this time. Sweden was a bit different. It was this bridge between the East and West. It was governed by a social democratic party for almost 80 years. Mm-hmm. And it was at the same time a society fighting this very capitalist movement.
I see.
And a sign of this is that just after McDonald's started up in Sweden, the state opened up a state-owned hamburger place as well.
I saw something about that actually when I was doing my research. That's interesting.
It was called Clock. And it was hard for McDonald's for the first 15 years to fight against like this state-owned company.
Yeah.
And Clock was very popular for the first time because they reached out to the working class, the growing working class. And I go back to when I wrote my thesis when exiting university. I wrote about soccer, which is actually my main history path that I've taken. I'm looking into the history of soccer.
Oh, great.
But my thesis was about how the working class movement used the papers of these football clubs, soccer clubs, to advertise their agenda. And this is pretty much what's happened with Clock as well. McDonald's was there. McDonald's was in Stockholm, in the big cities. But looking at in the rest of the country, in the industry cities, in the like up and up cities that were growing, it was a Clock. There was no McDonald's there because it was so tied to the working class and the Social Democratic Party.
I see. That's so interesting because it's like that's almost the opposite trajectory that the United States was going on at the exact same time. By the time you get to the 50s, 60s, 70s, it's Cold War, and any kind of socialism would have been pretty, that would be a huge, alarm going off from people. I don't want to, and government ownership of restaurants would be hugely like, no, that doesn't happen here. It's an interesting trend. So it's almost like the same exact series of events in the globe was seeing different trajectories depending on where in the world you were, and caught in the middle of it all is McDonald's. And it's attempt to franchise all around on the globe. I think that the next component of this, why did they make it? Yeah, we've pretty much covered that in a way. I know that the reason why the original McDonald's opened up was because the two McDonald's brothers, saw that there was, during the Great Depression, still a need for people to get something to eat. And of all the parts of the country that, everybody had their own level of suffering during the Great Depression, but of all the parts of the country that seemed to do okay, it would be California, particularly Southern California, because the movie industry was still thriving and there was a lot of produce, a lot of agriculture in the American West, along with, in California in particular, that still had people coming in and getting jobs. And so, if you ever take a look at the photographs of the cities in California during the 1930s, they look like everything's fine. You don't see people panhandling. You don't see the classic images of, brother, can you spare a dime, 1930s America. That's they wanted to have a competitive drive up, walk up kind of restaurant. And the reason why McDonald's eventually came out the way that it did was because they recognized that the model of the drive-in restaurant attracted too many unwholesome, unfamily friendly elements, that they really wanted to make a place that a family could go out to eat. And they wanted to simplify the menu so much so that they could offer a family a quick meal, very affordable, and a nice setting. And one of the reasons why they didn't franchise, though, at least not very much, I guess they attempted a few satellite McDonald's in the American Southwest, other places in California, one in Arizona, and they decided to draw out of that because of quality control. They felt that it was getting far too hard to keep. And, it's not like some companies where, there's no actual Burger King, as far as I know. But when your name is across the top, McDonald's, you take some pride in that, and you don't want somebody messing around with something with your name on it. So they were very cautious. And then they eventually said, no more franchising. But franchising by the mid 50s had become the word of the day for the American business world. In fact, the first really successful food franchise was that of Kentucky Fried Chicken, and Colonel Sanders, who sold his recipe of fried chicken to truck stops along the different roadways in the country. And, it wasn't a full standalone KFC, but it was, they would have a sign saying you can get the Colonel's Kentucky Fried Chicken here. And he sold that up and down the road because he knew, and then that, made it so a local business person, somebody who wanted to, get their feet wet in food service, didn't have to start from the ground up. They didn't have to, they could start kind of midway through. The name recognition is already there. They get the recipe, they get the equipment, they get the signage. And that's a great head start for a whole breed, I guess, of people who had never thought to be business people before, and suddenly now have that opportunity. They have a little extra money to invest, and why not go with something that is familiar? Would that be a similar story in Europe 20 years later of how McDonald's, who were some of the original franchisees, the people that would buy into growing McDonald's?
The boring answer is yes, it's very similar. It is, because, and looking at Europe as a whole, it would be people that had money to spare, that wanted to get into the food industry. And also worth noting during this time is that American culture is flowing in the veins of all Europeans. Mm-hmm. Hollywood has blown up, the music industry has blown up. There is Germany and France are losing in their grip on culture, and what is becoming big is the American culture. It's in Scandinavia, it's in Southern Europe, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
And McDonald's became like the brand for this. It became the brand for American culture. So it was very simple. It was very easy to buy into it. And looking in the 70s and 80s, the growth throughout Germany, throughout England, throughout France was massive. Mm-hmm. Every city had a McDonald's. And that would happen about 10, 15 years later in Sweden during the 90s. Then the exact same process would happen here. And right now, every city with over like 40,000 inhabitants, 50,000 inhabitants have a McDonald's.
Wow.
Yeah.
What would you say is the reason why American culture spread so freely and widely throughout the second half of the 20th century? I guess both technically and, what was so appealing about American culture in that time period?
I mean, the main part has to be the American influence during the Second World War and how America technically they put their stamp on Europe after the war. Looking at Germany, West Germany, America was there. They put the influence there, and Germany is often considered like the engine of Europe. If something gets established in Germany, it will spread out within the next 5-10 years throughout the entire continent. This, in combination with there are no established movie industry in Scandinavia at this time. There are movies being produced, but not at the rate that the moviegoers want to see the movies. So the Western films, they hit big. We have Swedish actresses going over to America, and Greta Garbo.
Yeah.
So there are so much like connection between the two, and we also had a great Swedish migration from Sweden to America during the late 19th century,
right?
Where thousands and thousands and thousands of Swedes are moving into the U.S. and still have connection with the homeland. Like 50% of my relatives live in the U.S. right now.
Wow. Okay, because that seems, because I don't know if I don't say it on the air, but I can point on my that I'm of Danish extraction. My dad's entire side of the family is Danish, and his family came over similar time period, between the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, and a bit unique because most of them ended up in Connecticut. But if you go to places like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, there are lots of Scandinavians. There's no shortage of Lutheran churches in that part of the country, just because of that huge migration. And so that I suppose, that is the explanation I was hoping for is, and a lot of it, you're right, has absolutely to do with the World War because of military bases. There, as far as I know, there's no American military bases in Sweden, though, right?
No, and Sweden made an active choice to stay out of this, to be like a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and the US. But I mean, Sweden was also a quite liberal country in the way that they did not actively close down the borders. They did not they didn't try to take down the information that came. They didn't. When the movies came, they didn't censor them. So it was just greater quality, the things that came from America at the time, which led to, in a very market way, it just beat out a lot of the already established brands.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the band America? They're from, they kind of an interesting history, but their biggest songs would be like The Horse with No Name and Ventura Highway is another big one of theirs. I saw them perform. They're on their 50th anniversary tour, 52nd year anniversary tour. Actually, wow. They actually arrived on the scene right around the same time McDonald's showed up in Sweden. But they started out they formed their band in London, and because they were, and this is something else I have in common with them, they were children of Air Force personnel, U.S. Air Force guys, and so they were stationed in England. And they during the concert, they explained, they said, and we call them brats, but as military brats, we had access to all of the American records a few months before our English friends did. So because the military base stores would get, all of the new releases and things of music, and I assume other media as well, to the U.S. kids overseas before everybody else. So they were kind of like the go-to for all of their English friends off the base to get the latest, everyone go to them first, like, oh, what's this new, album from, whatever, American rock band. And it's so funny to me because that's, just another component of that, World War II, Cold War back and forth that created a, at least in the Atlantic world, like almost like an Atlantic culture, like one standard, with some variation country to country, but yeah, for the most part, pretty much a uniform, so that, still to this day, if you were to travel from where I am here on the East Coast of the United States and go to a Western European country, it's not all that unfamiliar. I remember being in Ireland about 10 years ago. I went to Waterford, Ireland, which is one of the oldest cities in Ireland, if not the oldest. And I was actually kind of disappointed a little bit because as I was walking around, I'm like, this pretty much looks like where I live. Like, I was like, where's all the thatched roofs? And it just was like kind of same, newish buildings. There was a Wendy's, there was McDonald's, and all that kind of stuff. So, but that's just a product of everything we're just talking about. It's just so interesting how it works out that way. The 2016 film The Founder does a nice job dramatizing the transition of power over the McDonald's company from the McDonald brothers to Ray Kroc. But honestly, the story of how the company came to Sweden and the opening decade of it becoming embedded in that country's society and culture is worthy of a film in its own right. But even if The Founder 2 never finds its way onto the big screen, contextualizing it, as Johan and I were doing here, is very informative about Scandinavia and its place in the mid-Cold War era. So Johan and I were just talking before I hit record about the locations of McDonald's and where you see them all, and that kind of works perfectly because the next question on this primary source analysis that I do is where was it made and what locations are associated with it. We already mentioned before, the flagship stores of McDonald's in both parts of the world, but you really find them nowadays almost everywhere, don't you? They are sometimes strategically placed, like across the street from schools, so, can imagine teenagers can pack away a few burgers before, going home for the day. And where else in Sweden, particularly, would you find a McDonald's besides the urban areas?
Looking at the start of McDonald's, they obviously started up in the bigger cities, in the central part of those cities, like in central Stockholm, central Gothenburg, central Malmö. But during the 90s and late 90s, they started moving on to, as we talked about earlier, next to the large roads, next to the we have the European roads that go all across Europe, on the E20, the E4, etc. Right. And during the early 21st century, this is where pretty much all McDonald's are being built right now, because the city centers, they have their McDonald's, it's already there, and it's not going to close down because it's great business. But the great new ways of revenue is placing them next to the large European roads where a lot of cars travel by.
It's funny because that's almost now the opposite of the way things happened in the United States with McDonald's. And I was mentioning before how I did I took a fantastic class, and I was actually very grateful. A couple months ago, I did one of these podcasts with the professor of that class. She joined me for it. It was a class about American foodways. And when I was defending my thesis to the class, I was explaining it to the class and how I correlated the development of the roads. And, in this country, it starts with, in the late 1920s, there's the U.S. highway system. And that's where you have the famous Route 66. was part of that network of roads that starts on the East Coast with Route 1 and works its way westward with a, increasing numbers as you go west and north to south. And then the U.S. routes were eventually supplemented and some of them replaced, like Route 66 has largely been replaced by Interstate 40. And so my correlation was that fast food really started to develop and grew as we know it because of the interstate highways. And almost immediately I had a very, he was a super smart guy in my class, but he almost like, I was like, oh, because he goes, did you look into the way that it developed in inner cities, in urban areas? I'm like, oh, because I hadn't. I started like, oh my goodness, did he just like destroy my entire argument and thankfully I had, because, basically what I did was I took maps of the interstate system. I read articles about the interstates. I was doing my research, like we were talking before, everything's everywhere. I'm taking notes and everything. And it seemed to be far more consistent. And I think it's been true since the beginning of building of roads, that when a road is built, new settlements, new communities, new, everything starts to grow with it. And when a road moves, things start to die away. And if you have a company like McDonald's, which specializes in familiarity with basic menu, similarity between the places, and speed, it matches up much more with a travel culture than it does necessarily. And that's not to say McDonald's don't exist in the middle of cities. They absolutely do. But their beginning in the United States matches up closer with, they ran along with, the roadways. That being said, we find McDonald's everywhere. And that was actually Ray Kroc's vision. He said, I want to see the golden arches. I want to see the McDonald's symbol right there with the American flag and churches and, all the symbols of the country. The M should be part of those symbols too. And I mentioned to you, we went back and forth in email a few weeks ago, and I took a road trip to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And not only were there several McDonald's along the way, but actually like on the battlefield, like it's kind of, in Gettysburg, you can't go 5 feet without running across another monument or plaque or statue or something. And it's everywhere. And then, but there's a couple roads that there's like a Pizza Hut right next to General Lee's headquarters. And there's, and then like right next to where Pickett's charge took place, there's a McDonald's. And I'm like, yeah, people got to eat. People live in this town. They don't just think about the Civil War all the time, but it just seemed a little bit odd.
Yeah.
Are there any McDonald's that you can think of in Sweden that either whether they've been controversial or not, but people have kind of like, do we really need one there? Is that like weird spots?
I don't know of Sweden, but I have a very similar story because a couple of years ago, we went on a road trip in Germany. When it was this very dark road trip, we decided we wanted to go and experience the darkness of the Holocaust. Mainly because we were looking into establishing a cooperation between our school and a school in Germany, so we could take our students to visit some concentration camp. We didn't know which one. We needed a good a good school to cooperate with, but I can't recall which one it was, which one of the concentration camps. But we were standing there, like experienced the dread. Have you been in visited Auschwitz or something like that?
Nothing like that. The closest was this summer in Amsterdam. We went to the Anne Frank house. But that nothing. I mean, I've seen the images, of course, but I've never been to one.
Now, when you visit one of those places, it's like the dread that just goes through you. It's awful, and you look like a little bit to the right, and there's McDonald's arch just over the barbed wire, and it was so surreal. I wish that I could remember which. I need to look this up, but it was one of those, and that was awful. But looking at controversial McDonald's locations, we had a massive like build boom in many of Sweden's biggest cities during the 50s and 60s into the 70s when McDonald's arrived, where a lot of the old parts of the cities were torn down. All these nice houses from the turn of the century back to the mansions of the late 1800s, they were just, well, demolished to the ground, and they were gone. And in many of these locations, not necessarily a McDonald's were built, but that kind of architecture.
Right.
There were like these massive skyscrapers, and there was a fast food restaurant, and there was a parking lot. And so McDonald's could be considered a part of this very controversial destruction of the old historical parts of the bigger cities.
And that's also very reflective of the post-World War II, Cold War, atomic age way of thinking, that even if it was subconsciously, I remember hearing a quote there's a short film that I show sometimes in class about Hiroshima and the atomic bomb drops, and how they show modern day Hiroshima or Hiroshima, depending on how you pronounce it, and how it looks pretty much like every other city in the world. You look at modern, cities in this country, particularly in the West, once you get past the Mississippi River into places like, as mentioned before, Southern California or Dallas, Texas, or Houston, Texas, these modern cities that don't have much of a historical behind them. But the skylines are kind of hard to differentiate for each other, because the mindset seems to be, if all cities can be destroyed the same way, why build them differently? Because pre-atomic bomb drop Hiroshima was very unique and individualized. And I'm sure there's McDonald's there now, in the modern one. But afterwards, it looks pretty much, it's all about efficiency. It's all about, fast movement of people from one place to another, high-speed rails and all that, very modern ideas. And from that, you lose, and McDonald's is part of that. You'd be hard pressed. I was just traveling a few states away last weekend, and partly because I was looking forward to this podcast at McDonald's, I had a taste in my mouth from McDonald's, and I stopped at a rest area, and I was willing to pay the extra money, because rest areas are always much more expensive because they know it's their only option. But almost every single rest area in the country has a McDonald's, and that's not taking the place of anything else, because before them there was nothing there. But in the city I work in, it's one of the oldest cities in the country, and it has a very rich history from the late 19th century, mid 19th century, late 19th century, as a mill town. A lot of textile mills were there, and one of the homes that belonged to the owner of one of the mills is beautiful Victorian mansion on a hill. Is gorgeous. You can only find it in pictures now, though, because they demolished it right around the same time period, late 60s, early 70s, and now is a Burger King, which is every now and then been closed down for health purposes, health inspections and stuff. And I never see anybody there anymore, because Burger King is kind of like the forgotten fast food in this country. And I'm like, you just tore down that beautiful building, whatever state it was in, you still tore it down just so you could eventually put in fast food that now nobody eats anymore. It's just, it's kind of frustrating.
It is insanity.
It is.
And
Oh, go ahead.
No, that seems like a problem all across both Europe and United States. The people are being so unsentimental.
Yeah.
About all these old buildings, and the will to modernize everything.
Right.
And I think we are heading into some kind of reaction to this modernization of the late half of the 20th century and earliest part of the 21st century, and hopefully that will take form in the architecture as well.
Yeah, it does. There are definitely some resistance to it both then and now. There's people such as you and I who teach it, and that we want to make sure our students are very familiar with the past so that they're not, overlooking it. And I mean, you can't save everything. You have to, move along for some.
Exactly.
But I feel like there's certain places in the world that should never have, like you mentioned before, a concentration camp. You really shouldn't have something like McDonald's within sight of that. That should be, put it into the middle of the next town over. You don't need to have it there. Let that be a memorial that stands on its own. But we've all been to McDonald's. Who would you say is the intended audience of McDonald's in Sweden when it first opened up? I mean, we kind of hinted at this already, but was it families, individuals? Was there a particular demographic, social class that it was really geared towards?
It got to be the growing middle class, because during the 70s and 80s, the middle class were growing at a massive rate, both in Sweden but all across Europe. And this middle class had these expectations on it to own a house. They should have pretty much the same as in the United States. Mm-hmm. You own a house, you have a car, and you go on vacation once a year to maybe your lake house. And this seems to be the intended audience for the growing fast food industry, because it was, as we said, located next to the roads they would travel. It was in the middle of the city where they now would live or where mm-hmm. they would work. And looking at fast food as a general, it's not as cheap in Sweden as it is in or in Europe in general as it is in America.
Really?
Yeah, it's like 30-40% more expensive.
Really? Okay.
So it's, at that time, it was not really intended for the lower classes. It was more like a middle class concept. Nowadays, of course, the cheeseburger for $1, it's way more intended for the less fortunate of the society. Yeah.
And that seems to be pretty consistent here too, that the original audience, I mean, of course, if anybody can scare up the money to buy it, then, they can have it. But the majority of, at least with the McDonald's brothers, they wanted to see, families, they didn't want teenagers hanging out at their restaurant. They didn't want, anybody that is involved. They wanted, families. And of course, in that part of the country, Southern California, the suburbs were growing, from middle-class people that wanted to, have a nice meal, but not pay a lot for it. And it's kind of funny. My brother, he studied, boy, it's probably over 20 years ago now, but he studied abroad in London for a semester in college. And he was taken aback by the way Pizza Hut operates. You're saying about how McDonald's and stuff has, at least initially wasn't super inexpensive. And he said that Pizza Hut, at least the ones that he went to in London, had like nice candles on the table, and people would kind of dress nice to go to Pizza Hut. And for us, Pizza Hut is like, let's just go to Pizza Hut. We're, don't want to cook tonight or whatever. And you could just show up, come as you are kind of thing. And, it's kind of like a not silly place, but, definitely a lot more relaxed atmosphere. And so it's funny how I wonder why there's that translation of those kinds of establishments from, the United States to Europe that would allow for it to change that much and to be perceived differently. It's an interesting idea.
Oh, indeed. But wonder if it has something to do with this American culture being this exciting foreign thing, that when you want to go for a nice night out with the family, you go visit this very exciting place that was the McDonald's. It was another culture being exported into our culture.
Yeah, that makes sense, because I know that with even today, there's a lot of British style pubs that will open up, particularly and Irish pubs, and they try to replicate that, and very few of them are middle of the road. Most of them are a little bit nicer. And I always get a kick out of because one of my favorite English British Isles food is bangers and mash, and people erroneously refer to, they're like, all English or British sausages as bangers. and they make it sound like, and it's on menus like bangers and mash, or it's like $14 for. And I'm like, no, actually, that's kind of like lower class food. It's they're called bangers because during the war they had to fill them halfway with water, and they kept exploding in their pan. It's not a universal term for sausage, and yet in the United States, like, oh well, the British, this is a British pub. They might be watching us, so we got to make sure we're on our best behavior and best manners, because there might be British people here, judging us. And so, yeah, that's a great way of looking at it too, that it's when you exchange the culture, you don't want to be, almost showing disrespect by acting, like, your true self, I suppose. Do they have things like, so the next question I have is the ideas or behavior does it convey? And they've kind of taken them apart across some parts of this country. I know that when my son was very young, we used to go to a specific McDonald's because they had a playground inside. And I remember growing up that some of our McDonald's had very unsafe playgrounds, like metal ones, where you could like climb inside of the different characters' heads in the playground. And, if it was a hot day, you'd burn your skin on the metal, and you'd probably, get some kind of bruise from falling off of it and stuff. But do they have, or have they had play places at McDonald's in Europe or in Sweden?
Yes, they have. I remember growing up in the late 1990s. It was all across. Every McDonald's had a playground, but it have gotten fewer and fewer for each year. And maybe that's the same. I think that's the same all across both Europe and America. But especially because looking at the last 10 years, you almost don't see them anymore. All these playgrounds on the outside, all these climbing towers inside the McDonald's, they have almost disappeared. And I think one of the final blows to it was COVID.
Yeah.
Because one thing I noticed in general about fast food is that there are no longer any families there.
Right.
Especially after COVID. Now they're just ordering at home.
I know that, we here in this country, we're watching Sweden over the last couple of years, because I know that Sweden stood out from the rest of Europe in the way that COVID was handled.
Yeah.
And that it was much more just, go about your life, not shutting everything down, but, just kind of make your own individual decisions about things rather than, from the top down. But definitely the germ component, even before COVID, they started taking them, because those things could be gross, because little kids don't
they were awful.
Yeah. Like I have, and I won't waste your time or gross you out with a story I have from when I was in high school, and, just goofing off with my friends, we played in one of those things, and it was bad, the results. But it's also almost like they ran their own societies inside of those tubes and, things like little kids would go up there and like have, leaders and, courtrooms and stuff up there. And the parents had none the wiser. We're down there just enjoying our McDonald's food.
Yeah.
And the kids are all running their own world, right below us. So they probably, and I'm sure on a serious note, insurance prices probably got way too expensive for those places to operate, because they didn't, they would have signs up, play your own risk, and they would have age limits. But every time I was there, I always saw kids either way too young or way too old, just climbing everywhere. And I'm like, if they get hurt, this place doesn't, I'm sure, to keep their prices reasonable, they can't have the insurance as high as it was.
No, that makes sense.
How about the characters? I mentioned before about McDonald's Land. We have Ronald McDonald, Grimace. I'm not exactly, it seems like all the foods have some kind of representation, like Birdie, all the, poultry's in there, but nobody knows what Grimace is. There's the Hamburglar, there's all these characters, the Fry Guys. Did that make its way over to Sweden as well?
Yeah, it did.
Okay.
It did. And both in the toys.
Yeah.
The first toys coming to Sweden were the characters being given out as toys.
I see.
In the Happy Meals. But also in the commercials, they were heavily used in commercials. The Hamburglar was, I think it was the biggest one in Sweden. Ronald McDonald, the McDonald's clown, of course. Yeah, it made it here as well.
I have a photograph of my brother and I from when I was a little kid, and I remember the day vividly. They without any real reason, we just left our school. All the teachers led the students. We walked, and we lived on an Air Force base at the time, so it was safe to walk the kids from one end of the place to the other. But we ended up going to the base movie theater, and we had a presentation about dental hygiene. And for some reason, Ronald McDonald was there. Huh. I don't understand the correlation at all, but I have a picture that I still have somewhere of my brother and I standing with Ronald McDonald, his arms around us, and we're holding toothbrushes. And I'm like, this taken out of context, this is the weirdest photograph, but even in context, it's still weird. I'm like, so Ronald McDonald's going to teach us about brushing teeth? It still didn't make a lot of sense to me. But he's become, and all those characters, it seems, are like institutions almost. That you don't see them as much anymore. And at least in this country, I'd say roughly 15, 20 years ago, there seemed to be a major blowback against McDonald's. Yeah. And, Ronald McDonald was demonized. They made him look awful. And, there was the documentary Super Size Me, in which a guy ate McDonald's for every meal for a month, and he had all these health problems as a result. And from that came some things like McDonald's reporting its nutritional, quote unquote, nutritional content on all of their food, and, having to tell you how many calories were in each food item and things like that. In my own research, I saw that Sweden it's one of the countries in the world that has a vegan McDonald's menu.
Yeah.
How long has that been around for?
Probably since somewhere around 2015, I think.
Okay.
They had a Mac Bean prior to that has been around since forever, but it wasn't that good. So since during the last 6-7 years, it has developed into it's actually a great vegan menu, but not almost all fast food restaurants in Sweden have a vegan menu because it's so spread across the country. Mm-hmm. People are being vegan.
And that's so, again, it seems like, to kind of wrap things around, from what we were saying, as far as McDonald's is a product in this country of the time period. It's if it wasn't for the way things were happening in the 50s, we likely wouldn't have, the San Bernardino McDonald's may still be going on, but it'd be a local, regional thing. And likewise, it seems that the way that it's developed, in order to stay relevant, not only as a company just in the globe, but also in each country that it's moved into, it has to sort of react to and reflect the needs and wants of the society. Otherwise, what I was reading, it said that in Sweden, 1 in 10 people are vegan, right? And that
would make sense.
Is that a trend that seems to be pretty consistent?
Yeah, that seems accurate.
And is there a particular reason for that, as far as you can tell, that a lot of people have turned to, because it's not just vegetarianism, it's vegan. All things animal products are shunned, right?
And worth noting is even people that are not vegan are eating vegan more. Yeah. I mean, me myself, I'm not vegan in any way, but I think that I'm eating some sort of vegan food at least once or twice each week. Mm-hmm. Because I think it has a lot to do with the environmental factor. Yeah. A lot of people that you ask says that, well, I do it because the meat industry is bad for the environment. A lot of people says that they do it because they don't want animals to be harmed. So it seems like a very individual choice, but that it has a lot to do with the environmental debates.
Yeah, and it's also just the taste too, because even if it's not exactly like a hamburger, it might have a good flavor all to itself. And
it had gotten better. Looking at vegan food over the last 10 years, each year it's getting better, and now a vegan burger is good.
Years ago, a friend of mine who is a vegan, I'm not sure if he still is, but he was eating vegan for a long time, turned me on to these soy chicken nuggets. Mm-hmm. And I preferred them over. I'm like, I would go out of my way to get them because I'm like, I just like the taste better. And, I didn't have any it wasn't a personal thing against, eating chicken. It was just, I like the taste of it. It's really good. And if there is some health benefits to it, yeah, sure, I'll take it. That's fine.
Yeah.
So the last question is one that I sometimes leave out because it's kind of hard to answer for everything, but is this prescriptive or descriptive? And I think with a place like McDonald's, a lot of it has to do with, and we've already touched on this a couple of times throughout this great conversation, how it's marketed, how it's advertised. If you were to describe McDonald's, the way it was described or the way it operated in the 50s and 60s, it just appealed to the audience here in the country right away, because it matched exactly what they were interested in. That was good food, fast, right? Nice, wholesome atmosphere. Kids will have a place to play. You get all that business. And but if you were to describe the exact same thing, maybe 20 years afterwards, you're gonna get people be like, I don't want any part of that. So would you say that it's remarkably different, that the way that McDonald's has been, because the United States has a 20-year head start on McDonald's, starting in the 70s and beyond, how has McDonald's been marketed, especially since they had a state-run competition, right?
Yeah. I mean, looking at the first stumbling 10, 15 years, it had quite a hard time to establish themselves. In the cities where they got a restaurant established, it was quite easy to just put up like flyers, like do the regular marketing. There wasn't that much marketing on the television because that was also heavily regulated, but I don't have time to get into that. But everything pretty much starts in the late 1980s, early 90s. Then it gets heavily marketed everywhere, and that is the same time where it gets spread all across the country.
And it becomes, as it is now, an institution. Yeah. I think so many people have, whether they oppose McDonald's outright, they don't like anything it stands for, or just don't go there as much. I think it's a realization now it's here to stay. It's not going to go anywhere. And despite maybe the shady origins of the franchise version of McDonald's, I think we've all recognized in both the United States as well as in Sweden and the rest of Europe that it is a really interesting document of not only the time period from which it emerged, but throughout the last going on 70 years now of having McDonald's in our lives in one way or another. So I can't thank you enough for arranging that time. It took us 4 months, but we finally got it to work. It
was amazing.
I'm glad we did this. And I have to ask you, because you produce so many of those great Edutainment Daily videos, do you do one a day, or what is your process for making or do you have like a recording session that you do several in one day?
I try to have 2 recording sessions each month where I produce between 14 and 20 videos. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to do it.
Right.
It takes so much time out of that. But I managed to take 2 weekends, pretty much a weekend off each month to pre-record it. And then all the writing I am getting done whenever, because I'm also posting 2 written pieces each day. But that doesn't take that much time. Right. I write whenever I have time to find something up.
You and I are very similar, and that's why I'm glad that we got to do this, because I find that this podcast is not contrary to what I do for a living. It's very much part of it. It runs parallel. So, and likewise, I think Edutainment Daily and the Everything is a Primary Source podcast also run parallel to each other. So I'm glad that we intersected. I'll use another metaphor there in this circumstance. So thank you again for joining, Johan from Edutainment Daily. And for all of you listening, this is the EPS podcast, where everything, including McDonald's, both in the United States and in Sweden, is a primary source. And we'll talk to you next time. We're about halfway through Season 2 of the EPS podcast. I hope you've enjoyed listening to what you've heard so far. Full-length episodes like this one are being delivered on Thursdays, while shorter episodes, the products of my EPS podcast live exhibits, come out on Tuesdays. If you like what you hear, considering becoming a patron by going to patreon.com/EPS podcast. Follow the show on social media, including YouTube and especially on Instagram. I look forward to tuning in again to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source.